For thousands of years, Tel Megiddo, in northern Israel's Jezreel Valley, has been linked to war, prophecy, and the idea of Armageddon itself. But beneath that reputation, archaeologists uncovered something that doesn't fit the story we think we know. The Israel Antiquities Authority, IAA, excavation team found ritual objects from a biblical-era cult, sealed in the ground and hidden for 3,300 years.
What we found are several fantastic and very intriguing objects that were found in the bottom of several small pits.
These shocking finds at the Armageddon site were not broken, scattered, or abandoned. They were placed with care, then left untouched as empires rose and collapsed above them. But the most disturbing question is this: who hid them? And why was this exact spot never disturbed again? Beneath Armageddon, something was waiting. What was buried near Tel Megiddo was not accidental, and it was meant to stay hidden for thousands of years. In November 2025, just meters from the hum of modern excavation machinery, the IAA team was carefully stripping away layers of soil at Tel Megiddo. That's when they noticed a patch that felt different. The earth had already been opened, but here the stones lay too neatly, the soil pressed with intention rather than collapse. This wasn't the aftermath of violence, nor debris from a ruined city. It was deliberate. Every detail suggested planning. For the archaeologists, in the midst of routine excavation, the ordinary act of uncovering soil had become the first glimpse of something extraordinary, a space that clearly did not belong. Tel Megiddo has never been quiet ground. For thousands of years, this hill has watched armies pass through the Jezreel Valley, watched empires rise, fight, and disappear. Egyptian forces marched here. Assyrian power pressed through it. Biblical texts remembered it. Long before it became a symbol in the Book of Revelation, this landscape already carried a reputation. Decisive moments happened here, again and again, which is why this moment stood out. What was emerging from the soil did not look like the remains of a battle or a collapsed building. There were no weapons, no ash layer, no broken walls. Instead, the placement suggested care. Whatever had been put here was meant to stay exactly where it was. The excavation itself wasn't planned as a grand discovery. It was a rescue operation, carried out alongside the construction of Highway 66, the kind of work that usually uncovers fragments, bits of pottery, traces of daily life. But Megiddo rarely behaves like an ordinary site. Every layer has a memory, and every disturbance risks opening something far older than expected. As archaeologists continued, it became clear this area had been returned to again and again over centuries. Nearby were signs of early agriculture, including installations tied to wine production from the very beginnings of urban life. The land outside the city walls was not empty. It had a purpose, even when the city above it changed hands. And now, something else was waiting beneath the surface. Not lost, not destroyed, hidden. In a place famous for conquest and prophecy, the ground was preserving a different kind of story, one that didn't announce itself with fire or force, one that had been sealed quietly, just beyond the reach of the city, and left untouched as history thundered past overhead. A city built for conflict. The fact that ritual objects were quietly hidden near Megiddo becomes more unsettling once you understand the kind of place this city always was. This was never just another settlement. Megiddo sat at the narrow gateway between the coastal plain and the Jezreel Valley, controlling the main land route that connected Egypt with Mesopotamia. Armies did not choose to come here. They had to. That single geographic fact shaped everything. But even as armies fought over the city itself, some practices and beliefs quietly persisted beyond the walls. Rituals that would eventually leave traces archaeologists could find 3,300 years later. For thousands of years, whoever controlled Megiddo controlled movement, trade, and military access across the region. This is why the city was fortified again and again, rebuilt on top of itself, layer after layer. Archaeologists have identified more than 20 major occupation levels here, each one marking a different era of power, collapse, and return. Some of the earliest recorded battles in human history unfolded in this exact landscape. In the 15th century BC, Pharaoh Thutmose III fought here in a campaign campaign so carefully documented that historians still study it as the first detailed battle account ever written. Later, empires followed the same logic. Assyrians, Babylonians, and Egyptians all passed through Megiddo, not because it was symbolic, but because it was unavoidable. That reputation never faded. In the late 7th century BC, as the Assyrian Empire crumbled, the region was left in a dangerous power vacuum. Egypt pushed north to expand its influence, while local kingdoms scrambled to hold their ground. According to the Bible, King Josiah of Judah tried to stop the Egyptian advance at Megiddo and was killed in the battle. For centuries, this dramatic moment existed mostly on the page, debated and reimagined by generations. Yet while history remembered battles, it ignored the quieter traces of daily life, and perhaps of religious practices that endured in the shadows of Megiddo's fortifications. Until recently. Earlier this year, researchers announced the discovery of a large concentration of Egyptian pottery at the site, including serving bowls, cooking vessels, and storage jars. The volume and variety were striking. This was not the pattern left by trade or diplomacy. It looked like daily life. Meals prepared, food stored, routines repeated. Archaeologist Asaf Kleiman described it as a wondrous find, pointing to a physical Egyptian presence at Megiddo during that unstable period. The exposure of so many Egyptian vessels, including fragments of serving bowls, cooking pots, and storage jars, is an exceptional phenomenon. The most likely explanation is that Egyptian forces did not simply pass through after defeating Josiah, they stayed, possibly as an occupying or garrison force, settling into the city while the political landscape shifted around them. This matters because it reinforces a long-standing truth about Megiddo. This was a place shaped by power from the outside. Foreign armies arrived, settled, and left their mark. Control of the city changed hands, but the pattern repeated. And yet, even as empires fought over the city itself, life beyond the walls continued. The land surrounding Megiddo was not empty or forgotten. Archaeological evidence shows long-term agricultural use, including one of the earliest known wine presses in the region. This creates a contrast that is easy to miss. Inside the city, power shifted through war and conquest. Outside the city, people worked the land, marked places, and returned to them over generations. These spaces were not protected by walls or armies, but they endured anyway, and it's in these margins, outside the walls, beyond the gaze of conquerors, that archaeologists eventually uncovered the objects of a long-forgotten cult, hidden but not lost. So when archaeologists uncovered something carefully placed beyond Megiddo's fortifications, it forced a different question, not who conquered the city next, but who lived alongside it, quietly practicing beliefs that never entered official records. At a site defined by noise, conflict, and collapse, the margins were holding on to a different story, one that had survived every army that ever marched past. The ground beyond the gates. Whatever would later be hidden here was placed on land that people had worked and returned to for generations. Long before temples rose and armies marched, the land around Megiddo was already being shaped by human hands. The slopes beyond the city walls were not empty space or defensive buffer zones. They were working ground, fields, paths, rock-cut installations, and places people returned to year after year. Archaeology shows that this outer landscape mattered just as much as the city above it. One of the clearest signs comes from agriculture. Near the same area later disturbed by modern construction, archaeologists uncovered a rock-carved wine press dating back nearly 5,000 years, to the very beginnings of urban life in the region. This wine press is unique, one of very few known from such an ancient period when urbanization first took place in our region, said Excavation co-director Amir Golani. This was not an improvised pit or a temporary setup. It was deliberately hewn into bedrock, designed for repeated use, and positioned to take advantage of gravity and drainage. Wine production at this scale tells us something important. The people living here were not simply subsisting, they were planning, cultivating surplus, and investing labor into a product that took time to mature. Wine required vineyards, seasonal knowledge, and collective effort. It also carried meaning beyond nutrition. In the ancient Near East, wine moved easily between daily life and ritual life. It was drunk at meals, traded across long distances, and poured out as offerings. Even before formal temples dominated religious expression, liquids like wine, oil, and milk were central to acts of consecration. They connected land, labor, and belief. What stands out at Megiddo is how long this connection endured. The wine press belongs to the early Bronze Age, a time when cities were just beginning to take shape. Until now, indirect evidence indicated that wine could have been produced 5,000 years ago, but we did not have conclusive proof of this. A smoking gun that would clearly show when this happened in our area, said Galani. Centuries later, during the Late Bronze Age, the same general area outside the city walls continued to attract attention. Archaeological layers show repeated use, not random occupation. People returned to specific spots, often near natural features, like rock outcrops. Rock formations mattered. Across the ancient Levant, prominent stones and exposed bedrock were often used as markers, meeting points, or places of offering. These locations required no buildings, no permanent structures. They were open, visible, and accessible to anyone who knew their significance. This matters because official religion was not always open to everyone. Inside cities like Megiddo, temples were controlled spaces. Ritual access was regulated by elites, priests, and political authority, but belief did not stop at the gate. Ordinary people still marked seasons, asked for protection, and expressed gratitude for harvests. They did it where they could. The countryside allowed that freedom. Archaeologists often struggle to detect these practices because they leave subtle traces: a few vessels, a shallow pit, objects placed carefully and then left alone. They are easy to miss and easier to destroy, especially in landscapes that saw constant rebuilding and conflict. Megiddo should have erased them completely. Centuries of armies marching, walls collapsing, new structures built on top of old. Every layer of human activity threatened to bury or obliterate the quiet evidence of devotion. And yet these objects endured, tucked away in the margins, waiting to be found 3,300 years later. Foreign armies occupied the city, empires rose and collapsed, new populations moved in, yet somehow certain places beyond the walls remained undisturbed, not because they were protected, but because they were overlooked. Power focused inward, toward gates, palaces, and fortifications. The margins were left alone. This creates a quiet tension in the archaeological record. The same ground that supported early wine production, that fed the city and fueled its economy, also preserved traces of belief that never became official, practices that were never written down, communities that left no monuments. By the time archaeologists reached these layers, they were not looking for temples or battlefields. They were documenting everyday space, but the soil was holding on to something more deliberate than tools or waste. Something placed with intention, returned to, and then sealed. And in a place where history usually announces itself through destruction, that kind of silence is often the most revealing sign of all. What was hidden in plain sight? What finally emerged from the soil was not dramatic in the way Megiddo is usually dramatic. There was no destruction layer, no weapons, no signs of panic. Instead, archaeologists uncovered something far rarer at a site defined by chaos: a complete and deliberate ritual deposit. The IAA excavation team found ritual objects from a biblical-era cult that had been hidden for 3,300 years, sealed carefully in the ground just outside the ancient city. These were not scattered remains or broken offerings. They were intact, ordered, placed with care. Archaeologists identify the objects as belonging to a Canaanite cult, tied to the people who inhabited Megiddo during the Late Bronze Age, and are referenced throughout the Old Testament. Among the finds was a miniature ceramic model of a shrine, small enough to be held in two hands, yet detailed enough to reflect the architecture of sacred spaces that once stood nearby. Alongside it were animal-shaped ritual vessels, and a full set of containers believed to have been used for libations, the ceremonial pouring of liquids. Storage jars, serving vessels, and juglets imported from Cyprus were also part of the assemblage, a reminder that even non-elite worshippers had access to objects of real value. This is where the meaning sharpens. These shocking finds at the Armageddon site were not discovered inside a temple complex. They were not associated with palaces or administrative buildings. According to the archaeologists, the vessels were buried in an orderly fashion near a large rock outcrop, likely used as an open-air altar. The location suggests a folk cult operating beyond the city walls, possibly practiced by local farmers who could not participate in official temple rituals. Liquids mattered here: wine, oil, milk, substances tied directly to the land and the work of ordinary people. Historians believe these offerings were poured through specially designed vessels into funnels, a physical act of consecration that linked labor, belief, and place. Nothing about this was casual. The burial itself appears to have been the final act of the ritual. Eli Escusito, director of the Israel Antiquities Authority, described the excavation at Megiddo as one that reveals history, layer by layer, showing how much of the region's story remains in the soil. Each layer preserves a different moment in time: the rise and fall of cities, the movement of armies, and the daily lives of the people who lived there. Some layers hold obvious evidence: walls, inscriptions, and signs of battles, while others contain subtler traces: a few vessels, a shallow pit, objects carefully placed and left alone. Only by examining each layer can archaeologists uncover these quieter signs of human activity. The hidden ritual objects near Megiddo were discovered in these marginal layers. They were not part of grand destruction or public buildings, but tucked away in soils accumulated over thousands of years. Like a forgotten book on a library shelf, they reveal the beliefs and routines of people who quietly practice their rituals, surviving armies, reconstructions, and centuries of change. Megiddo's layers record more than power and conflict. They preserve the lives and practices of people who might otherwise have been forgotten. That perspective matters, because this discovery fills a gap archaeology rarely gets to fill. Official religion leaves temples, inscriptions, and monumental remains. Folk belief usually does not. It exists in gestures, objects, and places that only make sense to those who return to them. That is exactly what appears to have happened here. The objects were not abandoned, they were hidden, sealed intentionally, perhaps during a period of instability, religious change, or shifting control over the region. What followed only adds to the irony. Centuries after this cult disappeared, Egyptian soldiers occupied Megiddo. Archaeologists have identified their presence through cooking pots, serving bowls, and storage jars from the late 7th century BC. Foreign armies lived, ate, and ruled here, yet the ritual deposit remained untouched beneath their feet. No one disturbed it. No one reused it. The cult vanished, but its material memory survived every conquest. In a place synonymous with final battles and prophetic endings, the ground preserves something quieter, not a moment of collapse, but an act of belief carried out by people whose names were never recorded. The discovery does not change Megiddo's reputation, it deepens it. Beneath Armageddon's image of destruction, there was continuity. Beneath empire and war, there were hands pouring offerings into the earth, convinced that what they were doing mattered enough to be remembered. They were right, but how does a small deposit of ritual objects, buried quietly outside a city, survive armies, empire shifts, and millennia, yet still tell the story its makers intended? After the offering was sealed, once the ritual objects were placed in the ground, the story did not end. It simply went silent. There are no signs that the deposit was disturbed, reused, or reopened. No evidence of looting, no later additions. The vessels remained exactly where they were left, sealed beneath layers of soil, as centuries passed overhead. That silence is one of the most important details archaeologists pay attention to, because it suggests intention rather than accident. This was likely not done out of fear or urgency. There are no traces of destruction or sudden abandonment nearby. Instead, the careful arrangement of the vessels points to a controlled final act. In many ancient cultures, sealing ritual objects marked the closure of a sacred space. A practice ended, not because it failed, but because circumstances changed. At Megiddo, change was constant. Political control of the region shifted repeatedly. Canaanite city-states declined. Egyptian influence surged and receded. New powers moved in. Religious systems evolved. Temples were redefined, and older forms of worship lost their place in official life. A folk cult operating outside the city would have been especially vulnerable to these transitions. Rather than dismantle the space or discard its objects, the people involved appear to have chosen preservation through concealment. The offerings were returned to the earth that had produced them. Wine, oil, milk, the products of labor and land were symbolically given back, along with the vessels that carried them. What happened next reveals how effective that choice was. Centuries later, Egyptian soldiers occupied Megiddo during the late 7th century BC, following the collapse of Assyrian power. Archaeological evidence shows their presence clearly through everyday items: cooking pots, serving bowls, and storage jars used for routine life. They lived where others had ruled before them. They altered the city's rhythm, yet the ritual deposit outside the walls remained untouched. No army camped directly over it, no construction destruction cut through it. Even as Megiddo continued to be reshaped by force and authority, the ground where the offerings lay stayed quiet. Power focused inward, toward gates and strongholds. The margins were ignored. This pattern reveals something subtle about how history unfolds on the ground. Major events attract attention. Battles, rulers, destruction layers. These become the anchors of memory. But spaces associated with everyday belief often survive precisely because they do not announce themselves. They leave no inscriptions, no monuments, only objects placed carefully, waiting to be rediscovered. The ritual site also changes how we understand time at Megiddo. The wine press uncovered nearby dates back nearly 5,000 years, to the beginnings of urban settlement. The ritual objects were buried around 3,300 years ago. The Egyptian military presence came much later. These are not isolated episodes. They form a sequence showing how the same landscape was reused for different purposes, without erasing what came before. Agriculture, belief, and power all intersected here, but not at the same moments or under the same rules. For archaeologists, this kind of continuity is rare. Sites like Megiddo are often so disturbed that quieter traces are lost. Here, the absence of disturbance becomes the evidence. The fact that no one touched the deposit for over 3 millennia speaks as loudly as any inscription. What survives is not just a set of objects, but a decision made long ago, to step away, to close something respectfully, to trust that the ground itself would remember. In a place known for battles, conquest, and prophecy, how did a small Canaanite cult manage to bury its rituals and leave them untouched for 3,300 years? What Armageddon really preserved. When people hear the name Armageddon, they imagine an ending, a final clash. Fire, collapse, and judgment. Tel Megiddo earned that reputation honestly. Armies marched through there for thousands of years. Kings fought and died there. Empires treated it as a gateway that had to be taken or held. History at Megiddo is loud, but what the ground preserved was something else entirely. Beneath the battles, beneath the later occupations, beneath the stories written by victors, the soil kept a quieter record. Farmers tending vines, people returning to the same rock outcrop generation after generation, hands pouring wine, oil, or milk into vessels shaped like animals. A small shrine model placed carefully into the earth, not to be displayed, not to be destroyed, to be left alone. That contrast forces a rethink of what survival actually looks like in archaeology. Empires came and went. Egyptian soldiers cooked meals inside the city. After King Josiah's defeat, their pottery broke, scattered, and became part of the record of conquest. The cult outside the walls left no trace of violence, no sign of resistance, no monument, and yet it endured longer than any army presence ever did. Eli Escusito once described excavations like this as a process of revealing history layer by layer, and Megiddo may be the clearest example of why that matters. Each layer does not replace the one beneath it. It sits on top of it, often unaware of what it is covering. What survived here was not power, but intention. The people who sealed those ritual objects were not shaping history as kings do. They were not trying to be remembered. They were marking meaning in a way that made sense to them, trusting the land rather than authority. That decision allowed their belief to outlast cities, religions, and political systems. It also reframes how we understand biblical landscapes. Places remembered in Scripture are often treated as stages for singular events, a battle, a prophecy, a death. Archaeology shows something more complicated. These places were lived in continuously. Sacred meaning shifted, practices overlapped. Official religion existed alongside informal belief, sometimes in tension, sometimes simply out of sight. At Megiddo, the cult did not challenge the temple. It did not compete with power. It existed beyond it. And when the time came, it was closed carefully, not erased. That may be the most unsettling part of the discovery. Armageddon did not only preserve violence, it preserved restraint. It preserved a moment when people chose to end something quietly, rather than let it be consumed by chaos. In a landscape defined by conquest, that choice feels almost defiant. The final irony is this: the cult disappeared without a name, without texts, without memory, and yet it waited longer than any prophecy attached to the site. 3,300 years later, it surfaced intact, not because it demanded attention, but because it avoided it. What was hidden near Megiddo was not a secret meant to shock the future. It was an act meant to be complete in its own time. The shock comes from realizing how effective that silence was. Armageddon is remembered as the place where everything ends. Archaeology suggests it is also a place where something very human was carefully set aside and allowed to endure long after the noise was gone. If armies, empires, and even biblical battles passed over this ground without disturbing it, what made this small Canaanite cult choose this exact place to hide its ritual objects? And why did no one ever touch them again for 3,300 years? Let us know what you think in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.